Hi, I'm Jenny Liu, Trade Sales Director at Springer Nature. Today, I'm excited to welcome you to Overdrive's In the Know series on why social science matters. 2025 marks 25 years since Palgrave Macmillan, now part of Springer Nature, revived the Palgrave name. Palgrave publishes award-winning and impactful books for professionals, academics, students, and curious minds in the humanities, social sciences, and business. Our social science books program is a cornerstone of the imprint, helping readers to better understand the world, inspire solutions, and drive meaningful change. Through the Social Science Matters campaign, Palgrave underscores the importance of social science in addressing global challenges. Today with Overdrive, we are excited to present the latest books from Palgrave Macmillan that speak to current trends in the headlines. Our expert authors will address pressing questions on contemporary issues in politics, public health, and emerging technologies, including artificial intelligence. Our lineup of authors includes Eleanor Fournier Toombs, who is the head of Anticipatory Action and Innovation at the United Nations University. She is the author of Gender Reboot. The next is Ted Schrecker, who is Emeritus Professor of Global Health Policy at Newcastle University. He is author of How Politics Makes Us Sick. And last is Robert Bartholomew, who is a sociologist and fellow for the Center of Skeptical Inquiry. He is the author of Social Panics and Phantom Attackers. And now I'll hand it over to Eleanor for our first book talk on Gender Reboot. Thank you so much.
Hello, my name is Eleanor Fournier Toombs. I'm the head of a research program at the United Nations University, which is Anticipatory Action and Innovation. And basically, United Nations University is a research wing of the UN. And so we do a lot of research on the pillars of the UN, so humanitarian action, human rights, peace and security, and sustainable development. And my area of expertise is really in AI policy and technology. Before doing policy work, I worked as a data scientist for quite a number of years, doing predictive analytics at the UN. And so my main task was to try to understand the different parameters and characteristics of humanitarian crises, and be able to predict potentially the impact of different crises, whether natural disaster or conflict or pandemic. We did a lot of work during COVID-19 around compound risks. So what would happen if you have a pandemic and then natural disasters combined in different countries? What effect would that do? And over time, I became very interested in women's rights in relation to AI and technology. I started writing this book during the early days of the pandemic. This was a time when I think I really realized to a greater extent the gender imbalances, particularly around unpaid labor and care work. Like many people around the world, I had small children at home. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was a 9-month-old and a 4-year-old. And the closings of the schools and the daycares was very difficult, in particular because I was working on COVID-19 recovery, addressing the issue and then trying to rebuild the economy afterwards, both for the United Nations and also for the World Bank. And I felt that this was really brought to light for me, the difficulty in participating in technology development and leadership for women, because we're so dependent on women for unpaid work. And I spoke to a number of friends who were in similar situations, who were doing high impact work in law or in journalism, and really trying to contribute to a very challenging time in our society, but they couldn't. They couldn't participate very much because they had to take care of their children at home. And I think we all love children, and this is not a complaint about that, but it really made me think a lot more deeply about some of the continued imbalances in our society. And the book is really a reflection of that, and a connection to my area of interest, which is AI and digital technologies. There's a lot of discussion in our society about the fact that women don't participate to the same extent in the digital economy. And this is true around the world. In some countries, it's worse than others. So, for example, the digital divide in South Asia is known to be much greater than in other countries. And what that means is that women have less access to the internet, and they have less access to internet connecting devices. As we see in the book, the typical percentage of technology workforce in any given company around the world is between 25 to 30% women. And so I think that we ideally think, well, there should be equitable representation, or at least representation proportional to the population, which of course is more or less 50% women and 50% men. But I think there's a lot more to that. There's the fact that AI and digital jobs are very highly paying, and there's a huge gap in terms of the kinds of work that women tend to do, which are much less paid than the kinds of work that men do. There's also the fact that technology and power are very intimately connected historically in human society. And so those who own and who develop technologies are typically the ones who hold the most power. And so by not participating fully in the technology space, women have less power, and they have less ability to change and impact society. So those are the kind of bigger elements. So the book is separated into 3 parts. It's separated into a first part, which is about work. And it has 3 chapters that discuss really the differences in men's work and women's work, and this kind of binary representation of work, and where this comes from. It talks about the unpaid labor that I've experienced myself significantly. It also talks about this question of leadership and how difficult it still is in our society for women to be leaders, and the way in which technology development might contribute to that. It then goes on to a section, the book then goes on to a section called Being, which talks about different elements of the physicality of being a woman. So, for example, sports, for example, safety, safety online, safety offline, and also stereotypes. So the way in which AI is now used to stereotype women, to create deep fakes that might sexualize women, for trafficking, all kinds of things like that. And the next part, the last part, is about learning. So how do we learn gender roles? What role does the education system have to do with this dynamic between, on the one hand, wanting to participate in the digital sphere, and on the other hand, being taught very kind of rigid and binary gender roles. And then also this idea that machine learning and artificial intelligence have their own learning processes that attempt to mimic human learning and are similarly flawed in that way. And so this is kind of an opportunity to rethink the role of, or the dynamics of women in technology, and the way in which we think about the role of women in the development of technological systems. When I typically break down this book into main risks and challenges of AI for women's rights, I think about 4 things. I think about the way in which AI tools might discriminate against women and other groups that are historically marginalized. So, for example, the output of an AI system might be different for a woman than it is for men. And we see this in a number of of types of AI tools, for example, recruiting systems that have been known for the last 7 years, 8 years, to occasionally discriminate against women. A big glaring example was a hiring algorithm that was developed by Amazon, which was used for several years. And in 2018, it came out in an article in Reuters that, in fact, it systematically discriminated against women by targeting specific elements in a woman's CV when she uploaded her CV to Amazon's website in order to apply for a position. And those terms would be, for example, if a woman has been the captain of female football teams, so any reference to the word female, the CV would be discarded. And also if the woman went to a historically female college, which exists in the United States. So Barnard College, which is a part of Columbia now, was historically a women's college. And there's several like this in the United States. And so it was very striking to me that one of the world's biggest technological companies, which also, interestingly enough, has a reduced ratio of women participation in its technical teams, at least at the time that I wrote the book, and was also called out for discriminating against women unintentionally through its algorithms and its hiring practices. Another example, which I talk about in the book, is AI tools that are used to attribute financial loans to applicants. So they look at or they evaluate different features of an application, maybe potentially age, credit history, all kinds of income, employment, all kinds of things like that. And then they give a loan amount. And there were many criticisms of the Apple Card to say that the loans that it gave to men was much larger than the loans that it gave to women, all other characteristics or features being equal. And that was, again, a discrimination, an example of discrimination through AI. And the reason why this kind of things happens is because the data that goes into training these AI models is often quite homogeneous. So the AI model was learning about who would make a best employee at Amazon or a best, a recipient of an Apple Card, credit card. And they were learning this on data that was not representative. So potentially more male data. There were more men represented in the data set. And because women potentially have a history of being less active in the labor force in the last 100 years, I guess, or potentially having less access to credit, then these biases are perpetuated by the AI tools. And so there's very simple mechanisms in order to redress these balances and these issues and ensure that there's no discrimination in AI tools, but it has to be intentional. So part of the book is also to bring to light these issues in order to address them in a constructive way. The second area that I look at in the book is stereotyping. And so this part is particularly the case in generative AI tools, which are trained on a lot of text on the internet that is quite stereotypical. And so the kinds of stereotypes that exist is ones that portray women as being inferior to men, for example, or ones that sexualize women in addition to that. And so those are examples of the stereotypes that are present in AI models. So in addition to discrimination and stereotyping, a third risk of AI that's discussed in the book is exclusion. And so I refer to it a little bit at the beginning of this talk, but really exclusion is about the fact that for many AI tools, women are not part of the different parts of the AI life cycle. So they're not part of the design phase. They're not in the data sets. They're not there, use cases are not being tested when the models are being tested. Women don't have access to venture capital, very interestingly. So less than 3 or 2% of venture capital allocated globally goes to women-owned businesses, startups. So that's a really, really glaring number. And then women are not part of the leadership of technology organizations as much. And so to me, this is really a kind of fundamental and deep question. And it's not about just, filling the representation gap. It's not just about hiring more women. It's about really thinking through the employment pipelines and the kinds of lifestyle that women have. Again, bringing back this really intense care responsibilities that women have, the kinds of discrimination that they face in the workforce, the way of communicating socially that we've been socialized to do that might be quite different. And so there's all kinds of different elements of why women might not be adequately represented in the development of technology. And that's a big risk because as these technologies are developed more and more, the lack of representation in the technologies leads to errors being missed, like this issue about discrimination or the issue of stereotyping. And the last risk that I look at in the book is the one of safety and security. So there's so many examples globally of the tools being done without women's use cases in mind, and their safety is threatened. And an example of this is a very well-known example of a ride-hailing app, kind of like Uber, that is quite pervasive and that was developed in Indonesia. And the app was used by many women, and women were getting kidnapped or raped after using the app. And so there was a real thinking through and criticism of this company in order to rethink how it was developed in order to put women's security front and center. And so they brought in AI tools to really enhance the security of women. So they had better biometric identification. They had a Share My Ride feature where women could share with a certain group of friends, especially if they were taking a ride by themselves late at night. And they added different kinds of features, thinking about what it would mean for women to be safe. And there's so many examples of women human rights defenders, for example, having their privacy breached by AI tools and having people post their information online, for example. So I think that thinking about is the application that I'm developing, is the AI that I'm developing, potentially harming women's physical safety or even psychological safety, and what could we do to mitigate that is really critical. And so with these 4 elements in mind, I think it really, the book thinks about, why this is the case, and why there's so many kind of strong risks to women's rights, and particularly women's rights as they were codified in the Women's Rights Convention from 1977 that really talks about, protecting women from discrimination, protecting women's work, women's safety, protecting women from stereotyping, and so on. And so why is it that AI tools pose a threat to that? And then more concretely, what could we do to mitigate that risk now that we're aware of it? So this is very constructive, especially because I'm quite involved in technology. I've worked as a data scientist. I love many of these tools, quite useful. Not every tool is useful, but many AI tools are very, very useful. But we need to address these risks, and it's quite urgent. And so that's really what the book is about. In terms of why this matters today, I think it matters, one, because AI development is accelerating, and we need to make sure that it's developing in the right direction. I think also because policies and strategies are shifting a lot. In the last few years, there was a big focus on risk and safety. And then in a few months ago, this focus pivoted to innovation and opportunity. And I actually don't agree with this idea that addressing risks and having safe AI is somehow opposed to harnessing the opportunities of AI. I think it doesn't make sense. And I'm against this kind of black and white binary thinking in general. But you would never be able to really, really harness the opportunities of AI if it's not safe. So that's the truth for any technology. We can't go and get into planes and fly planes if they fall out of the sky. We can't use pharmaceuticals if they kill people, So every time this kind of information comes out, it really has an impact on the pharmaceutical industry. And so I think it's the same thing for AI. You can't really deploy AI tools if they're harmful. And so I think this continues to be really important. But I think that the women's dimension is still a little bit limited because we still talk about just making sure that 50% of your AI workforce is women. And we don't really talk about all the other elements that I try to address in the book that give a kind of broader picture for why do we have hiring gaps. And then the other kinds of effects that are beyond just having 50-50 representation. And even, considering that having a kind of affirmative action perspective on AI hiring may not necessarily be the right route. There's a lot of other systemic issues that need to be addressed that are really critical. And so just taking one kind of action might just be patching an issue without really resolving it. And so my call to action really is, number one, I hope you read the book and I hope you find it interesting. And I also hope that you get to know the different AI tools available to you with a lens of understanding what it might mean from a woman's rights and from a gender perspective. And if you're interested in starting to work in or learn about technologies and how to build them, and starting to make more social impact tools or tools that are sensitive to the reality of women, I think that would be really fantastic. Thank you very much, and hope you enjoy it.
Hello, my name is Ted Schrecker. I'm Emeritus Professor of Global Health Policy at Newcastle University. By background, I'm a Canadian political scientist who moved to England in 2013 and returned to Canada in retirement at the end of 2022. For more than 2 decades, my research has involved the political economy of health, with a focus on health inequalities both within and among countries. My colleague Claire Bambra, who unfortunately can't be with us today, is an interdisciplinary social scientist and professor of public health, also at Newcastle. Her research likewise focuses on health inequalities, with a special emphasis on their geographical dimensions, how and why health varies dramatically, often among localities that are quite close to one another. Here's an example: the difference in life expectancy among census tracts in the city of Chicago is about 30 years, and it maps quite closely onto both their racial composition and their income levels. And I'm here today to talk about the second expanded and updated edition of a book we co-wrote shortly after I moved to the UK, How Politics Makes Us Sick. We begin one of the chapters of our book with the story of a young New Jersey woman who went to sleep in her car one night in 2014 and never woke up. She often slept in the car between her 3 low-wage jobs with the engine running and kept a can of gasoline in the car because she was afraid of running out of fuel. The can accidentally tipped over, and the vapors from spilled fuel ended her life. This is an extreme story, but it highlights the connection between what we call neoliberal epidemics and people's health. We identify 4 interconnected neoliberal epidemics: inequality, insecurity, austerity, and commercial determinants of health, especially as they involve the food we eat and what it does to us. They're epidemics because they've spread so rapidly that they would be considered epidemics by any responsible scientist if they involved an identifiable infectious agent. They're neoliberal because they share origins in a distinctive way of thinking about the world. Neoliberalism. The United States and the United Kingdom are the big, rich countries that have traveled farthest down the neoliberal road, and they're the 2 case studies we concentrate on, although we also use quite a lot of comparative data on other countries. Especially for people in North America, the term neoliberalism can be confusing because liberal is a word often identified with relatively progressive or compassionate social and economic policies. It even sounds a bit cuddly. But neoliberalism describes a remarkably consistent and ruthless set of perspectives about how the world works, and perhaps more importantly, how it ought to work. George Soros refers to it as market fundamentalism. And neoliberalism or market fundamentalism dates back at least to the establishment of an organization called the Mont Pelerin Society shortly after the Second World War. And in the book, we trace the well-financed promotion of these perspectives through such milestones as the election of Margaret Thatcher's Conservatives in the United Kingdom in 1979, and of course of President Ronald Reagan in 1980, to the point where by the 1990s, as historian Gary Gerstle wrote in 2022, neoliberalism had become dominant, its advocates compelling all political players to work within its ideological matrix. He was writing about the United States, but the observation is applicable much more broadly. Think, for example, of the third way promoted by Gerhard Schroeder and Tony Blair in the 1990s. So what is meant by neoliberalism? Well, many of us academics will argue about definitions until someone tells us to get back to doing useful work. Debates about how to define neoliberalism persist, but we identify 4 key propositions or presumptions, which we've reproduced on a slide. There is quite a lot of social science on all these points. What is distinctive about our book is that we connect the economic and social impacts of neoliberalism with research evidence on how they make many people sick and shorten their lives by way of the social determinants of health, the conditions in which people are born, grow up, live, work, and grow old. There was a major WHO commission on social determinants of health that issued its report in 2008. And the literature has expanded dramatically since the first edition of our book came out in 2015, and since the COVID-19 pandemic swept across the world. It includes research on such topics as the physiology of chronic stress, the effects of increased economic insecurity and outright destitution, and the impact of austerity, not only on social protection, but also on healthcare systems like Britain's National Health Service. In the United States, of course, economic inequality and insecurity have always played a pivotal role in how much healthcare and what kind of healthcare you have access to. All these situations, and many others we describe in the book, are the outcomes of political choices that could have been made differently, and in many cases, especially European ones, have been. Oh, How does our focus on neoliberalism fit with the disruptions that Donald Trump's second presidency has already caused? In one key respect, his obsession with protectionist tariffs, his policies represent a clear break with decades of neoliberal consensus, more or less across the political spectrum, in favor of lowering barriers to international trade rather than raising them. In all other respects, the Trump administration has faithfully followed the neoliberal playbook, dismantling regulatory agencies that protect public health and safety and the rights of working people, attacking social protections that are already fragile, enabling the influence of raw financial power in politics, and reducing taxes on the richest Americans. All this is likely to leave many people, perhaps most people, poorer, sicker, and more insecure. There is a political cure. It involves thinking about taxes as a way of making resources available to equalize people's chances to lead healthy lives, or at least to make them less unequal. It means rejecting the idea that regulation and public spending are inherently suspect, considering government not as an enemy, but as a helpmate, as in the case of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. In these times, the road back from neoliberalism will not be easy, but the journey is not impossible, although I think Claire is a bit more optimistic than I am on this point.
Hi, I'm Dr. Robert Bartholomew. I'm an honorary senior lecturer in the Department of Psychological Medicine at the University of Auckland here in New Zealand. I've spent my career studying things like UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, lake monsters, topics on the margins of science. I'm a sympathetic skeptic, and my interest is in how these reports of strange things go in waves. My book is on imaginary assailants, phantom attackers. Throughout history, mysterious figures have emerged from the shadows to terrorize communities only to vanish without a trace. Mad gassers, phantom slashers, young women being spiked with hypodermic needles, serial pet killers, cattle mutilations, claims of people being attacked by directed energy weapons. In some cases, schools have closed out of fear, businesses slow to a trickle. The streets are deserted with gangs of vigilantes searching for the assailant. But upon delving deeper, police eventually conclude something extraordinary. These nefarious characters never existed, but were figments of imagination. In short, they were the boogeyman. How is this possible? How can entire communities be paralyzed in fear for weeks or months? I've identified hundreds of similar outbreaks going back in time of collective panic attacks throughout history. These episodes are far more common than people realize. My book looks at the pattern in these scares, whether it's the Salem witch hunts or Havana syndrome. Let's look at a recent case study in the recipe for an outbreak. In the summer of 2021, there were reports across Britain of young women being stuck with hypodermic needles while clubbing with friends. In early 2022, there have been over 2,000 reports to police. Then hundreds of similar incidents were recorded across Europe. But out of all these cases, just a handful of people were arrested, and no one was ever convicted. No one. How is this possible? Remember, this was happening in nightclubs that had CCTV footage. People everywhere. No one was alone. They were with their friends. None of the victims were ever sexually assaulted or robbed. Thousands of police reports, headlines in newspapers, social media platforms filled with reports. Not a single person ever caught in the act. So here's what happened, which is typical of phantom assailant outbreaks. It all started with a single report where a young woman in Britain claimed to have been spiked by a needle while clubbing with friends. She didn't see the spiker. She said she felt woozy and later found a mark on her arm and assumed that someone had spiked her. It then got on social media and went viral. And it was quickly picked up by newspapers and TV, which carried headlines about young women who were spiked with needles out with friends. Then there was a whole campaign online to get people, especially young women, to check their arms and legs for needle marks when they returned home from a night on the town. Or if they were out at a nightclub, if they felt woozy, to quickly check themselves on the spot. Within a few weeks, there were hundreds of reports. Often they were filed the next morning after finding what appeared to be a pinprick, a scratch, a bruise, a blemish, something that was assumed to be an injection site. There are many images on social media. A lot of these things looked suspiciously like insect bite marks. But here's the thing. There's almost identical needle spiking panics in the United States around World War I. There were literally thousands of reports. No one was ever caught. The spiker always got away. Why? Because he was entirely imaginary. The same thing happened in the UK in the 1930s, and later in that decade in India, again in France in the 1960s. So my book looks at historical antecedents, how something happens today, and then you go back in time and it seems to recur over and over again. I look at all sorts of outbreaks and I document how they've happened throughout the past. In 1956, there was the Phantom Slasher of Taiwan, but a nearly identical slasher scare happened in Montreal, Canada in 1954, and again in Halifax in England in 1938. And this is the message of my book, that these scares keep happening, and we don't heed the lesson. Serial pet killer panics, which I document, have been going on for centuries. In fact, every one of these scares I look at has happened before. It only reappears in a slightly different form. They reflect prevailing fears. Phantom assailants involving Islamic schoolgirls, HIV and AIDS scares, the Indian monkey man panic of the early 2000s, the Spring Heel Jack scare in London in 1837. These episodes are triggered by prevailing fears in society. They are the adult version of the boogeyman. They are collective panic attacks. So my book looks at social panics and these scares over time.